All right, I think we're going to get started. Again, thank you everyone so much for being here today. My name is Julie Tesh, and I am the president and CEO of the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We are an organization that we do rural research on policy issues in rural Minnesota. It's great because we're very defined. That is what we do. And we've been helping host this interconnected series. I believe we're going into our second, maybe third year with Citizens League. We both care about civic engagement, we care about policy, and I feel like we really, we interconnect together, pun intended. We bring the rural aspect and that policy lens, and then Citizens League brings a civic engagement and a statewide lens and an urban lens as well. So we've had great discussions so far. Really excited about this one, dealing with local government. You're going to love our panelists today. They have a wealth of knowledge, and I'm also very excited, since we're a research organization, I am excited to hear about Citizens League's report that's coming out, and we're going to kick that off. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate Cimino, Executive Director of the Citizens League.
Well, thanks, Julie, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I also hope that you are safe wherever you are and aren't getting too battered yet by the storm. So Citizens League is based in St. Paul, but works statewide, and we work to get people more connected to public policy, to issues in their communities, and remove some of those barriers that often we feel or are real between people and policy issues. We've been doing that for about 70 years. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. You may know us for our Capital Pathways internship program, or for some of the many study committees and projects that Citizens League has led over the years. So this past summer, starting last spring and into the summer and fall, Citizens League has been leading a project. My colleague Blanca Martinez Gaviña has been leading on local government service in elected office, either through city council or mayor positions. And we've been looking at just the Twin Cities and 7-county metro area. So basically the whole metro area around the Twin Cities, suburbs, exurbs, and the main cities areas. And asking people, what's it really like to serve in these roles? What's it really like to show up every day as a city council member or as mayor, and often or always have another role or another affiliation in your community or a professional role as your job outside of that leadership position in the city. So we've been asking people, what's that really like? And part of our motivation was to get beyond some of the headlines we see, which has been a lot of doom and gloom about local government, hearing a lot of the kind of worst case scenarios of how some of the political polarization and strife has been showing up in local areas. And we really wanted to ask, is that really what it's like? Or how is it playing out on the ground day to day for people who are in these roles? So it's been a great project, and you're going to hear more about it from Blanca a little bit further down in this presentation. But to start off for this interconnected, we had this idea as part of this series to open up this conversation about local government service beyond just our report, and go statewide and really talk to people doing these jobs across the state. So that's who we have today. And I am so excited to have a great panel with us today. I'm going to put in the chat here for you all a link to the report. So if you want to take a look at that while we're talking, feel free. You'll hear a little bit more about it from Blanca as we move through today. But thanks for being here, and excited for a good conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian McClung, who's going to be moderating and facilitating our conversation today.
Great, thanks, Kate. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate the work of the Citizens League, both on this really exciting report that was just released on Friday. And so Kate mentioned she's going to put that link in the chat. So encourage you, take a look at it. We know we want you to be listening to and paying attention to our conversation, but feel free to skim through that online while you are multitasking as we have this great conversation. And also want to thank Julie Tesh and the team at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. You know, this interconnected series has really been a great opportunity for us to think about these issues that we deal with in the metro area and in greater Minnesota. And sometimes the solutions might be a little bit different, the personalities might be a little bit different, but we're all coming together to work through these issues. And we really couldn't find a better topic than this one: serving in local elected office why people run, why they decide to run, remain serving, or opt out. And thinking about this in the context of in all of our communities across Minnesota, trying to encourage and lift up and ask people to get engaged and think about what it takes and what we need to do to make that experience even better going forward. And this conversation has been especially relevant, I think, over the last year or so, as we've been talking about democracy, the future and the health of our democracy. And that's not always a topic that we've really expressly discussed as Americans. You know, most of the time we just kind of take it for granted that our democracy is something that is strong and that is going to be here indefinitely. And I think a lot of us have, had the realization that it takes active engagement. It takes all of us being part of this. So we're so glad to have you as part of this discussion. And starting it off with the mayor of Duluth, Emily Larson. And as we've talked about, we thought that Mayor Larson is a perfect person to have to kickstart this conversation, because Duluth really encompasses a lot of those different worlds. You know, Duluth is an urban city in a rural setting. And so it doesn't really fall easily into one bucket or the other. But it's a place that has seen so much success, that has seen so much growth, but also those challenges that come with all of that. So want to talk about that and about her journey and about a local elected office. So first of all, Emily, thanks for joining us for this webinar.
Yeah. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Great, great.
Good.
And also we want to say congratulations to you, as you've announced that you're seeking a third term, by press release yesterday and with an event a little bit later here today. So, I mean, that's a good sign, right? To start with, you must want to continue to do it. So tell us about kind of your announcement here and just some of what you're talking about as you kick off this bid for a third term.
That's awesome. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, it was, we did a little preface yesterday. We just did an event on the Lake Walk this afternoon, and then we'll have a gathering tonight. And what I talked about was, of course, the many, many things that we've prioritized, whether it's streets and roads infrastructure, lead pipes, resilience and sustainability, housing, the many, many things that cities are working through. But also elections aren't so much about what you did. It really is about what are you going to do? It is about having a vision to move forward. So really laying out, here's the foundation that we've set, but here's where we're going, and how to help support and strengthen and stabilize and grow, like you said, a very diverse community post-pandemic, experiencing all of the big city challenges of workforce and housing, public safety, our economy, but also being, the regional center, the place where everybody comes to get all their services. So thank you. It's a really exciting time to lead. And, as I said, I mean, it is not easy. I will say that. I'm not running because this is an easy job. But I am running because it's not. And who leads in our governments, whether that is county or school board or city council or mayor, who leads and how they lead really, really matters. And so I think for anyone listening, and many people listening are already leaders in a variety of ways, but if you're considering the elected path, leading with a vision, I mean, a lot of people can do the job, but doing the job well, doing the job with integrity and dignity and focus and stamina is built on a vision. And that's really different than just kind of running.
So, thinking back to when you were first elected, so you first elected to the Duluth City Council in 2011, before running for mayor in 15 and 19. And so thinking back to 2011, one of the themes in the Citizens League report is around the social referral process and support systems. And so there's really, I think, an interesting thing to explore here, that almost all of the candidates that the Citizens League talked to, and I think it was about 80 candidates, I think all but maybe one indicated that somebody else encouraged them to run for office. And so that was a real theme. Sometimes that's an elected official, sometimes that's community members. So maybe share for us, was there somebody that encouraged you or people that encouraged you to consider that first bid for city council?
Yeah, there was absolutely, and that's true. It is so true, that social referral, that kind of social contract, how all of that looks, how it feels, especially for women, especially for people who are not traditionally resourced or already deeply connected. Being asked is really meaningful. And the previous research I've seen suggested that women needed to be asked 7 times for every 1 time a man would be asked before they really considered running. And so, the quality of the ask, the density of the ask, it really matters. I remember the first time I was asked, actually, and I'm trying to think what year it was. It was probably 2006, 2007, something like that. I was at my city council giving testimony on an issue. This friend of mine named Marsh Stenderson, a very very storied labor leader in town here, pulled me aside, tapped my shoulder. Sister, can I talk to you in the hallway? Brought me outside and said, here's my name, here's my number. I'd love to talk with you about what you envision. It was 5 years later or 4 years later that it actually came to fruition for me. And some of that was the confidence I wanted to have about what I was doing. It was seeing myself in the role and not just deflecting and trying to support other people. It was building the relationships that, again, for women, historically, for generations, we have not had access to those informal networks of fundraising or relationships. And so there really is a channel of, development to go through. And I think we're seeing more of that now, excuse me, as we're seeing, this much more diverse and interesting and inclusive kind of funnel of people coming through. It's really exciting. Many of these candidates have spent, a long time getting to know themselves and building up their resources and doing it with intention. And so their campaigns are really exciting to watch. But I was 100% that person, and absolutely was working for other candidates and managing other campaigns and recruiting other people. And there is a story, I kind of won't get into it, but when my spouse kind of turned the tables on me and essentially was like, wow, you're asking somebody to do something that you're actually you're capable to do, and let's do that instead. So even in our own homes, we have to be challenged to really see ourselves in a leadership position sometimes.
So one of the other themes that came through in the Citizens League report is the idea of issues, the kind of policy issues as a gateway or a path into running for office. And I thought of that too, Mayor, because you mentioned, that you were testifying at the Duluth City Council, right? So you were already engaged in from an issue and from an advocacy perspective. But one of the things I think that's worth exploring here too is that while sometimes there may be one particular issue that is somebody's passion and that gets them to run, once they're in office, that doesn't necessarily stay as the main focus of the whole host. So maybe you can share, was there something that made you think like, I need to run because I want to advance this thing, but then you get there and there's more
oh my
and
gosh
other things to work on?
Yes, and this is something that I know every person in an elected position could speak to this. I mean, for me, I was testifying about a housing first model, which at the time was a very innovative practice, working with people who were experiencing chemical dependency and homelessness. And so it was this very specific model I was supporting. And then from then until I first ran for city council, it was working on the marriage equality issue. It was opposing voter ID. It was very specific issues for me. And then, you build a strategy and a passion around that, and you have to continue to maintain your core and your passion around those issues. And when you're elected, you also do have to balance that with, you are no longer an advocate, you are governing, and you do need to think through how you are showing up for issues beyond the ones that called you to that moment. And also to recognize that at certain points, it's the toughness of the job is that it can't be as nuanced as you want it to be. At a certain point, as a city councilor or as a mayor, you're voting yes or no on something. You're not voting maybe with this and that. At some point, a vote has to be taken. And so that's a really hard learning curve, is to kind of understand that you can't be the expert on everything. You do have to learn what your synapses are going to be to trust people's expertise and judgment, how you want to influence that. And at what point are you going to say that this issue, this project, this vote, this what proposal is enough of a yes that I can get to a yes? Even if in my perfect world, as an outside advocate or as an outside issue-based organizer, I'd push for something more or something different. And that is a very tough learning curve. It's an important learning curve, and it's a maturing learning curve, and it looks different on everybody. But that's when you know that you've kind of moved into the elected role, when you're able to figure out what that nuance is going to be for you, so that you can actually function and not get hung up on every single issue.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, and I think that nuance speaks also to something else that's in this report and that we've been talking about, which is the idea of these roles as nonpartisan roles. And this Citizens League report is really is focused on mayors and city councils. I think in many ways it also applies to other nonpartisan positions like county commissioner or school board. But as you think about the kind of nonpartisan nature of these jobs, and then contrast that with how partisan our politics is more broadly, right? And especially at the national level, but certainly at the state level as well. And so maybe just tell us a little bit about how you feel like, is there a way to kind of protect that nonpartisan space for these kind of local elected positions? Do you feel like the partisanship that we see elsewhere is bleeding over, or is there a sense still that people are wanting to kind of protect that nonpartisan vision of what local government is like?
Yeah, there's so many questions to your question, and it is an interesting discussion. It would be fun to hear other people weigh in. I do think that the rhetoric makes it harder to stay in a nonpartisan place. When there is national policy debate or change around whether it is reproductive choice or marriage, or pick something else that might feel overtly political, people in your local community are accessing channels of whether it's healthcare, reproductive care, or civil marriage that is deeply personal to them. And so I do think it's hard to maintain the total nonpartisan piece. I also think that it's possible, and that it's important to, because truly, a park is not a Green Party or independent or Republican or Democrat. A library doesn't care whether, how you vote to get a book. Like, so much of the work we do, everybody should have clean water and get their streets plowed. So it's really important for that trust to be there, that you're demonstrating it as a leader. Like, you may have these personal ideas, these personal values, and you're going to work to protect people's safety and all sorts of different things. And that you're also going to do that universally. You're going to uphold the law of your community or your state. You are going to protect people in every neighborhood so that they feel safe. It is challenging though, because and maybe it depends a little bit on the feedback loop you yourself need as an individual. And I will say, the more I am off of Facebook or tools like that, the healthier my feedback loop is, and the more grounded I can be in the work that I'm doing. And so there is some real value to knowing yourself and understanding that I don't really need people's comments on an article or keyboard kind of warrioring to understand that the work that I'm doing or this community is doing has value and is important. And the 10 very loud people don't get to dictate what the 1,000 quiet people get to have access to. And so that is just, for an elected person to balance that, that's just discipline and practice and confidence and kind of letting go. And so there's a lot to unpack in your question.
Well, I'm curious about that, just a little bit more on that last point, which is how hard is it for you to ignore the comments? I mean, I tell my PR clients always, like, don't read the comments on the news story, right? But then I read them, right? I can't help it. I feel like I should know. Someone should. But for you, you know, and a lot, it's personal, right? Like these are decisions that you made. This is, you put out the budget for the city, you know, you're voting on things. And so how is it difficult to ignore Twitter or to ignore Facebook when people are, you know, kind of speaking out, or how do you find for yourself personally,
you know,
are you able to moderate that?
Well, that's a great question. And it isn't hard for me, to be honest. It's not that it's enjoyable, but I just don't do it. I mean, it is honestly just a lot of discipline. I tend to be a fairly disciplined person. I'm dedicated to getting up and running in the morning. I go to bed and get a good night's sleep. You know, there is a certain amount of stamina and discipline that is required if you're going to be an effective candidate, if you're going to be an effective elected leader, because you can't take the bait. And I will say, Brian, that people are reading those things. I mean, and what I have told my team is, hey, let me know if it's important, right? And you kind of calibrate that. And I do think that somebody absolutely needs to be kind of seeing, okay, the trend is this, the thought is this, the theme is this. And then you get to sort it out and say, okay, are we going to be defensive about it because it's actually misinformation? Or are we just going to let that noise exist on its own? I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking through, how are we going to engage the community? How are we going to authentically respond to people? To be honest, it isn't very hard for me to block it out. I would not have been able to say that 15 years ago. You know, there's a certain amount of just aging and grounding, and, you know, I had teenagers. I mean, it's just like, you kind of get used to it all. And at a certain point, you're like, well, I don't really need your permission. I have this work. I'm campaigning, like now I'm campaigning. You'll let me know if I have your permission in a year, and I'll work to earn that. But until then, I'm going to keep doing the work that we said we would do, because that was what I was elected to do. These are the commitments that we made. You will let me know how that's going, and I'll pay attention along the way, but I don't need your daily permission to exist or to lead or to be successful. And I think our staff, you know, for every elected person, every mayor, every council, your staff needs you to not take the bait. Right? Your staff is doing incredible work. We have 850 people who are showing up for this community. And the more that I'm out there taking the bait, or, you know, being solely political or chasing a narrative, that's distracting from just being the foundation upon which people build their lives.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I look at it.
No, I think that's really healthy. I think that's good advice for folks who might be thinking about this or considering getting into this, that, yeah, you can't, otherwise your sole focus will be those comments, the 10 loud people, and it will prohibit you from serving the thousands that may not be quite as noisy. So I think that's a good approach. I want to mention to everybody here that if you have questions, you can share those in the chat. I'm going to save those questions until we get to a panel discussion later on here. What the agenda here is, Mayor Larson and I are going to finish up this conversation here shortly, and then we're going to hand it over to Blanca Martinez Gaviña with the Citizens League for a review of the report. So she's going to walk us through some of these highlights and do a much better job of telling you about it than I have been in my questions. And then after that, we're going to invite Fergus Falls Mayor Ben Schierer to join us, and Lakeville City Council member and Mayor-elect Luke Hellier to join us. So then we'll have a conversation with two mayors and an about-to-be mayor from different types of cities across Minnesota. And so at that point, I'll weave in your questions from the chat. So if you have questions, if you have ideas, share those, and those will be compiled by our team and funneled over to us so we can see them on our screen. And then we're going to have the opportunity to share that as we go. So before I hand it over to Blanca for the review of of this report, I just wanted to ask Mayor Larson, any particular barriers that were in the way, or as you considered running, what were the things that kind of gave you pause as you thought about it? And there are some, of course, in the report that are common, but I'm just curious about as you got into it, and then I guess as you continue to serve and say yes, you sort of have to do that reassessment every time.
Right.
There's certainly other things you could be doing with your life and other activities, and
That's
so
right.
there's certainly barriers in there. Just curious to get kind of your thoughts and any guidance you have as people, what to look at and consider.
Well, to be honest, so I've been elected now for 12, 11 years, 4 years as council, 7 years as mayor. Everything gave me pause, Brian, like everything before I announced. I was terrified. And it was such an important and awesome process to work through, because by the time you announce for office, hopefully you've come to terms with the fact that you might lose. And if you haven't, you shouldn't run yet. You're not ready to run yet. You got to be ready to lose, because if you're not ready to lose, you won't put everything out there to win, right? You don't know what's at stake for yourself or your family or your community. That doesn't mean you plan to lose. That doesn't mean you build a plan to lose. That means you put everything you've got into winning, because you've already worked through the emotional side of that. But I would say, I was a parent. So thinking about our sons, what would that be like for them? And I have to say, it turned out to be beautiful and wonderful. And of course, they get to see some of those comments, and they get kind of a kick out of it, actually. But they also got to meet and hear all of this really interesting discussion about their community. They know about pothole materials. They understand what happens in an emergency. I mean, it was really also this really big opening up. I had to think about my marriage and my husband and how we were going to divide up. We often have to have the same discussions every marriage does about how's this going, how are we dividing up, responsibilities, who's doing what. We made a very intentional choice for him to become the primary caretaker, for instance. So I went from being the person that the school called or the doctor's office or whatever, to him being that person. And that was beautiful, because in their teenage years, they spent a ton of time with their dad. And that's something a lot of young men don't get to have, right? So I think for me, it was kind of looking at, okay, I was scared to fundraise, but then I ended up loving it, because it's like, once you know what you're about and you're excited about it, you want people to invest in that with you. And if they give you $1, they're in that work with you. The amount doesn't matter so much as the gift. And so, to be honest, every piece that was challenging, what's my vision, who's going to stand with me, who's going to stand against me, all of it became just kind of another steady brick to build and put in your foundation, into my foundation. Mm-hmm. Every fear, every challenge, every time I was like, oh, you just keep walking, you just face it, you unpack it, you think about it, you challenge yourself, and then it becomes a strength. So I will just say, anybody here listening, most people I know who are running or have run or are serving, they will spend time with you. I will spend time with anyone who wants to reach out and call and talk about how to work through some of that. Your path is your own. No one else is going to tell you how to do it for you, but you can glean from others how they kind of made it through. And I will say, I was terrified of it all when I started. And I'm so happy that I was, because it meant I really spent time thinking through every one of those variables and pushing through it and walking through it and leading through it and voting through it and getting to this point, which is really an honor.
That's great. Now, Mayor Larson, I wouldn't normally do this, but I'm going to do one question for you before we hand it over to Blanca.
Okay.
And that's because Bill Werner with Minnesota News Network has posted a question, and Bill was always there with a microphone for all those many years that I was Governor Paletti's press secretary. So I feel I should at least give him the chance. He wasn't able to be there for your kickoff, and so he wanted to ask just one question so we can all see just what it's like when you're serving an elected office and the questions come in unexpectedly. He's curious and wants to get your take on what is the biggest challenge you see for the city of Duluth?
Well, honestly, it is the whole restabilization after a pandemic. And that's a very general answer, Bill, but there's a lot to it. So, what I have really been focusing on and thinking on, and if you want to reach out to me, I don't have your email offhand, Bill, but I'll send you my speech that I wrote and gave today. It is really about the social connections that have dissipated since the pandemic, and the fact that people, really miss each other. How people are engaging with the community, what that looks like. And that's inclusive of, how it feels to be a business owner and to watch your business walk away because people aren't working downtown anymore. It is about, adapting it's about there we go. That was me. Adapting downtown buildings to become housing. So there's a lot of pieces around restabilizing after the pandemic. Some of it is truth and reality that's been uncovered for all of us. That was always there, but we didn't know. Some of it is new fear and kind of protectionism around what we all have. So I actually talked a lot about all of that in different ways in the speech, Bill, but if you want to reach out to me, I'd love to get that to you.
All right, perfect. See, we take whatever comes at us. This is
what we do, Brian.
Serving a local elected office. It's great. Well, that's perfect. Now, with that, I want to hand it over to Blanca Martinez Gaviña for a kind of a summary and review of the report, and then we'll come back and have the panel discussion with our 3 elected officials. So, Blanca, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you, Mayor Larson, for doing such a great job. I feel like you did review a lot of what this report says, so I am so appreciative of that. So I just wanted to go through some of the highlights of this report, and Kate Semino, who is the executive director for Citizens League, dropped it off. And again, I am Blanca Martinez Gaviña, public policy director with Citizens League. So some of the things that I wanted to also highlight in terms of the work that we did is that the work and some of the collection that we did really did focus in the metropolitan area. So Twin Cities, the suburbs, and the exurbs, we did receive around 21% of the total possible elected officials in this area, which is a really great percentage point. And also another thing that I wanted to mention is that we were able to do 66 online surveys. So we were able to hear from 66 folks through that medium. And also we did 14 one-on-one interviews with local elected officials. So some of the themes that we found through this, and as you heard, Mayor Larson did speak to some of these themes that were found throughout the report. In one of the themes, we talked a little bit earlier about the social referral process and support systems. And of course, this is a great point to start with because, as it was mentioned, only one person indicated that they had not been asked to run by anyone. The rest of people were asked to run. And another point of interest is that women were less likely to asked to run by an elected official rather than a community member or other immediate support systems. So that is something to think about when we see folks that are being asked to run, who is asking them to run, and what is the kind of social capital that they have. Theme number 2 that we found was issue gateway as a path to policy. So as Mayor Larson described, some of those concepts and some of those issues when you are an advocate, and what does that mean once you're elected? We found that a lot of these issues were very much emotionally driven, politically charged, and very relevant to a personal lived experience or something that they were seeing in community. So this was really the gateway to think about running for office, and it's what oftentimes carried them through the election process. One second here, I'm just so again, some of those issues shifted over time, and once they were elected into office, it was that those themes became less and less emotionally driven, and they were more sustainable policy decisions that had ongoing feedback from community and very much focus on that bipartisan unity as time went on for elected officials. Another theme that we really did explore was with barriers and challenges, where some of the really constant personal attacks, whether it was social media, whether it was a lot of times via emails, or oftentimes some of the candidates reported getting letters at their homes, or some of their family members being targeted. One area of research that we found consistent was that candidates of color raise issues at being targeted more often, and the threats were more consistent, and the threats were a lot more personalized. So that is something to keep in mind when thinking about the experience of candidates of color and elected officials of color. In terms of other barriers and challenges, we also found that finances, personal finances, can be a challenge with a job like a council, as a council member or as a mayor. It is considered to be part-time, but what we often found is that it's definitely not a part-time job, that there's a lot of time commitment, a lot of meetings, a lot of ongoing conversations with community members, community events, and that sustainability was very hard to manage with a full-time job. So, just to give you a sense, we were able to collect s- the the different per year salaries that were considered in the metropolitan area. We found in average for mayors in here in the metropolitan area, it was around 12,320. For council members, it was 8,125. So for those that might be having a hard time balancing, and they might want to lower their hours in their full-time job, you can see how this can be an unsustainable lifestyle for some of those very much interested in putting all of their focus on their elected official position. Also, another barrier was really that of fundraising. Many folks did not have experience fundraising, and half of the folks that we talked to, half of them mentioned that they did have a lot of issues fundraising. They had never been taught to fundraise. They didn't know who they could take money from, where they could fundraise money, and what were some of the different areas where they could think of or get creative about running an election. So that's something else that really came up in more than 50% of the candidates and elected officials. Another theme that we also talked about a little bit was in terms of what is uniting the community. So, what are some of the nonpartisan efforts? What are some of the things that elected officials were doing to create that transparency and engagement from their whole community? As Mayor Larson described, there's one point of advocating as a candidate, and then there's another point when actually becoming an elected official and governing. And a lot of elected officials and candidates talked about, the nonpartisan work, that there was a quote saying there's no Republican or Democratic way of filling a pothole. So really thinking about what is that some of that consensus, and they found themselves trying to find those skill sets that could bring unison across political parties in their community. And they talked a lot about staying away from some of those more polarizing conversations that might be happening at the national level or even at the local level. In terms of another theme that we found was the financial stability balance. That was a hard one. A lot of folks talked about how they were leaving office because they needed to focus on their full-time job. They wanted to start families, or they already had a family. So in terms of balancing that work, some of them were stepping down primarily because of that it is hard to manage. It's hard to build a personal career when you have to balance that work from your elected position. So some of those are high level themes that we found through our conversations with elected officials and candidates. We also had some recommendations that came through with the research. Some of those recommendations were in terms of mentoring programs. What are some ways that we can connect folks that are interested in running for office and those that are already in office? We found that there's a lot of resources that are partisan for folks that are interested in running for office, but there's not a lot nonpartisan efforts and mentoring programs and learning programs for folks that may be interested in these positions and don't want to take a partisan route. Also, that we recommend for opportunities to build social capital. As we mentioned, that social capital is key into running for office. Women are less likely to be asked by an elected official. They tend to be asked by community, by close social networks. So what does it look like for those non-traditional candidates to access social capital? What kind of social capital is can be built in the process? So how is it that we can provide as communities opportunities for people to build that? Another recommendation that we had was, how is it that we can continue to preserve this unique nonpartisan space of local government? So what are some conversations like this one that we can have as to why it is so important to keep some of those polarizing aspects from away from these local government positions? And maybe how can we begin this conversation as people are thinking of running for office and once they make it into an elected position? We also recommended to explore innovative financial and work balance support systems. As I mentioned, one theme that emerged is that work life balance and the inability for people to stay in office if they wanted to build um, a career, because that balance was not there. So for folks that do want to run for office, that want to dedicate their time, how can we make sure that we have maybe some financial resources for them to make it through that time? We also recommend, as a cliche, continued research and data. So again, this report really did only focus on the metropolitan area, so Twin Cities, suburbs, and exurbs, and it definitely is. There is a need to explore the rural area and to also think about what are some other points of data that could be interesting, maybe to expand it beyond the mayor and the council members, and include the school board candidates and elected officials, county and other areas of government, as well as maybe thinking about what is the experience of those running for those partisan positions in our state governance. So those are some key recommendations that we wanted to bring forward as a way to just continue that conversation and think about how can we continue to build on some of the experiences of people running for these local positions. In the report, you will also find support systems and resources for people that are interested in running for office. We want to make sure that despite some of the fear, despite some of things that we highlighted, there is such a need for people to run for office, and we want to make sure that we encourage this passion and this commitment for this pillar of democracy that is running for office. And The report again is linked to the chat, and we welcome any feedback and any questions I know are going to be taken at the end of the conversation. So thank you so much. I know that was
Blanca,
a
there's
lot.
a question for you right off the top here. Are you ready? It says,
Yes.
my question was going to be, will there be a study on non-7 county metro communities, or is there a similar study in the past? Some of the themes would be similar, suspect others are different, especially with regard to financial obligations. They mentioned that their councils paid $2,500 annually, the mayor $3,000 annually, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So this is from Mayor Emily Durand in the city of Wabasha.
Mm-hmm. So currently, we're not aware of any other study that has been done specifically for this area. There is a national study that was actually released 2 weeks ago, and it was done nationally that also included board members. And I know that they were looking specifically at some of those themes around specific barriers for BIPOC elected officials. So that's a great report. But again, nothing that has been localized. I think there should be a next step. We are open to partnerships. We're open to exploring what could it look like to do greater Minnesota to get a better perspective as to what the experience is there in running for local elected office. So definitely we are open to that possibility, and I think there is a need to capture that experience as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And yeah, thank you so much for the review of the report. We're going to transition now into our conversation back with Mayor Larson, but also bringing Mayor-elect Luke Hellier into the mix, and Mayor Ben Schierer as well. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this part of the discussion. Yeah, there's a lot we can explore, and I think, you know, as we said, is that question highlights, you know, other room for opportunity and further study and understanding of what, you know, this experience is like across the entire state. But that's why we're glad to have the three of you as our panel. Again, Luke Hellier, City Council member in Lakeville, just recently elected as mayor. Ben Schierer, the former City Council member and now mayor in Fergus Falls, and Emily Larson from Duluth. Luke, I want to start off with you on this one, and we talked about this a little bit with Mayor Larson, and that is thinking about kind of preserving that nonpartisan space. And I'm curious to get your take. And you know, one of the pieces that I want to explore here is that there's a difference between campaigning and governing. And I think when you're campaigning, almost by default, you're going to talk about some issues that have a partisan flavor to it, right? You're campaigning in the middle of an election cycle. It's not just about you. There's a bunch of other people on the ballot, a whole bunch of, you know, issues swirling around. And also, you know, certainly you want to turn out your voters and your supporters who may be motivated by partisan politics, or your supporters might be aligned with you, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then there's that pivot into getting the job done and doing the work, which is less partisan in many ways. So Luke, maybe share for us a little bit your thoughts about how to, you know, preserve that kind of nonpartisan piece of local government, but also kind of some of the differences you see between campaigning and serving.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Brian, and thanks to everybody for having me on today. It's good to see my future fellow colleagues of Minnesota mayors. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. You know, I think what's really unique about local government is, to your point, Brian, yeah, I mean, you may campaign, you know, together or what have you, and utilizing some volunteers that may have a partisan bent. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think people are more concerned about to make sure that their road is going to get plowed, you know, and or if their kids are going to be able to get to school, or you're going to be able to get to work, and what the future of their community looks like for growth, and what type of investments from a park or infrastructure or water resources, and that stuff is what really matters. And so for me, you know, when I go door knocking, those are the type of issues that I start with. It's not the issues of the day, maybe politically, but certainly the issues that are why we're running. And I often got asked the question about, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? And I have no problem answering about my partisanship, but I said, hey, look, I spent the last 6 years on city council, and I think my record kind of speaks for itself. And I think I've done quite a bit to kind of reach across both sides of the aisle in our community. The only difference is that we've added, 20,000 people in the last 20 years. And so it's a different Lakeville from where I grew up. But I think that's probably the approach that I try to take, is really to think outside of that partisan lens as much as possible in that governing space.
Yeah, and Mayor Schierer, we talked about this a little earlier today when we were prepping for this. Curious to get your thoughts on that same topic. And in part, because greater Minnesota has seen this shift in partisanship, right? And it's the sorting that's occurring nationwide, where, rural areas are becoming more Republican. And so I figure there's, with all of that, there's, more of that kind of partisan influence in politics. Curious about how you've seen that evolve over the, past couple of decades. You were first elected to the city council in 2004. So now you've, had 18 years of experience in city government. Just curious over that time frame, if it feels different now than it did, in the early mid 2000s, and how you personally navigate some of those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And thanks to the Citizen Leagues for that report. I think famously, Tip O'Neill said about 40 years ago that all politics is local, and increasingly all politics is national. And of course, people care about the roads, and they care about the potholes, and they care about the garbage being collected. But there also is this thread running through our communities of national politics. So I think that to get away from that is increasingly difficult. I think over the last 6 years is when I've really noticed that it's increased. So I think it's a challenge. I will say this. I think the other thing, being in a mayor in greater Minnesota and rural Minnesota, just knowing the political division that you mentioned, I think having strong relationships with with people in St. Paul, with the people that are elected there, is important as well. So balancing that is something that is not always easy, but I think it's very important. And I'll be the first to admit, that I haven't always maybe done that the most effective way I can, looking out for the interests of my community. But also, when elections come around, I think we all, as human beings, need to stand up for the values that we care about. And so it naturally does tend to, as Emily I think said very well earlier, when you're out there, some of these issues, they may not be naturally political, but they are at the same. They're not partisan, but they are political. And then in the world we live in, sometimes those two worlds just naturally come together, and just have to navigate it the best we can. But I do think it's really the opportunity to heal some of these divides that we have, and is to realize the connections, but is that space that we do live in as elected officials in local government is nonpartisan. And the more we can focus on that, I think the better off we all are.
Mm-hmm. And Mayor Larson, kind of going back to some of what we were talking about earlier, and the labor leader that you mentioned, who kind of tapped you on the shoulder and talked to you about running initially. I'm curious to get your thoughts about mentoring people or encouraging them to run. Now that you've been in this role for a while and you're thinking about trying to inspire others and get them engaged. Tell us about, any experiences you've had with that, or your thoughts about how best to mentor somebody. Because the mayor from Wabasha mentioned, in the chat here after we were talking, that, it might not be possible for people to make the commitment to do this, no matter how they are mentored or supported. But just want to get your thoughts about what's helpful, what do people need as they're doing that?
Well, I love this. So I was smiling as you were asking the question, Brian, because it's one of my favorite things actually is to talk with people. And it tends to be often it's younger women who will reach out to me, but really any person who has an interest. And what I actually really work to do, whether we have a Lead for America fellow here or a Vista here, somebody who's in a very specific, like they're in a mentor position, mentoring position, mentoree, I should say position. Even on my own campaigns, I really like work to pair some veteran campaign people with people who've never done it before. In part because I think our democracy and our organizations are better when we have people coming into a process and they're coming into it on their own terms, right? And they're learning about it, because often what happens, whether it's in a campaign or in an organization or in the communities, you just keep hearing from the same people, and you're not necessarily getting a bigger or better or more robust product by listening to our own kind of closed voices. So my experience has been wonderful. I have loved working with people. And the first thing I will always tell someone, if they actually are interested in running for office someday, and some people when they're 18 or 22, they know that. I didn't know that at that age, but it's great that they do, right? So it doesn't matter whether they're being overtly like, I want to be mayor one day. I think that's great. Come on in, I will shadow you, or you can shadow me, we can talk about that. But I will always say, start on a campaign. You gotta learn the work of what it is to build community in an intentional voter, nonpartisan way. Get involved in something bigger than yourself, so that you're not centering just your own experience at the center of why you want to lead, but that you're actually grounding it in what's happening in the relationships that are around you. And when I was coming up, just in my professional life, before my elected life, I always had a mentor. I always reached out and specifically sought people and said, hey, I love the work that you do. I don't know if that's the work I want to do, but I like how you lead, or I heard you give a speech. Could we have coffee? Could I learn a little bit from you? People never said no to me. And it's not that I was like so dynamic. It was more just people don't say no when you reach out. They genuinely want to hear what you want to give back to your community. And it's not about making a mini me or a mini you. It's about making a you that's going to only get bigger, and how to have that play into the civic space and the civic realm. And the more that I think we are getting people mentored into this work, the better that is for citizenship and civility and kind of the bigger democracy things that aren't about being a Democrat or Republican, but are actually just about existing in a diverse, universe of people that do better when we respect each other. And so I would encourage, if there's anyone who has an interest in being mentored or in just a phone call, so rarely will people say no, and it'll probably just be because they're busy. But we don't get asked as much as you think. I don't have as many students as you think reach out to want to interview for a project. But anytime they do, I love doing it. I think it's great. And you can tell that the student is nervous and they don't want to get things wrong. And I remember being that person. And so you're able to just say, oh yeah, no, take your time, ask the question. And they just get to kind of see, oh, you're just a person with an interesting job. Mm-hmm. And the more we have people also see that Ben and Luke and I are just, we're just people with interesting jobs, the more that they're going to see themselves as somebody who might be able to have that job. And that's really good for all of our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Luke, I want to take this next question to you. It's in the Q&A here, talking about how, some of what the report is describing are the financial barriers, why it can be difficult for people to run, and that leads itself into a gerontocracy, right? That you have mostly older people that are financially stable at that point in their career when they feel like they can do that and what some of the things are. But you're a younger person who is, in elected office and is navigating this. So, right, we're still younger. You're younger.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely are.
I think I'm young and you're younger. So
yeah.
You just want to get your thoughts about that. Certainly financial barriers can be an issue, but curious to get your take about if that's what you hear from your colleagues who are running for local office, if that's a concern, or if you think there are ways that, things that we can do to help mitigate that over time.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think I was chatting with the current mayor the other day, and I think that I'm at least in recent memory, the only Lakeville mayor that's going to have a full-time job and school-age kids in like the last 20 years. So it's going to be a challenge in that. And so right away, I've said to the Lakeville Chamber, hey, we need to pick a day of the week for ribbon cuttings, right? Because I've got a normal job. And so if you want the mayor at the ribbon cutting, let's say Tuesdays are going to be the day in 2023, right? But kind of to what Emily had talked about earlier before I was on, is that I have a supportive spouse. I mean, my wife and I both are really dedicated our community. When I was first on city council, she was the president of our church council. And so just managing the fact that, city council was the first, third, and fourth Monday nights. And so we had to move church council to the second Monday night. And so we really both kind of work back and forth. And so we move into this new kind of season of life with being the mayor. We had a discussion on what that would look like for us. And I think that's really important, just, inside your home. The other is I have a job that's relatively flexible, so that helps as well. But, conversations I've had with trying to recruit people to run in others is certainly related to the finances. It's not easy at all. And the biggest challenge for me has been I have a flexible job, but it also requires a lot of travel around the Midwest. And so I just am trying to always manage to fit into that, and then also not just miss the city responsibilities. And so that can be a challenge, but I don't think it should be a barrier. I mean, you just work and figure it out. I mean, the easiest way to say it is that you will learn to manage a schedule. And I think it can be overwhelming sometimes. But I just certainly have to, you got to make the priorities. And we are lucky in our community. My wife and I both grew up here. Our parents are still here. And so the fact that we have a 9, 7, a 4-year-old and newborn twins, but we have 4 grandparents in town makes it a little bit easier. And my brother lives one town over, and my wife's sister and husband live 2 blocks over. So we have it a little bit easier to manage all those type of things because we can rely on our family for that stuff.
Of course, now with your twins, your children outnumber the grandparents. So
that's right. Yeah.
You're not just outnumbered as a couple, you've now outnumbered the grandparents. So,
yeah.
But congratulations, of course, on your twins. It's fantastic. Ben Schierer, wanted to kind of get the same thought from your perspective, in Fergus Falls. As you talk to people and recruit them, or they approach you about running for council or getting engaged, is the financial issue, is that something that comes up? And do you also see that, is that a barrier for recruiting younger people and the next generation to do these kinds of jobs?
Yeah, just to kind of echo, I think what Luke and Emily said, I don't think it needs to be, but I think that we need to tell our stories. We need to go out there and recruit people. I've seen incredibly effective city council members that have full-time jobs that are not flexible, that do not allow them to attend every meeting, but they're still able to work it into their schedule. I've also seen, obviously seen retired people who have all the time in the world who are, ineffective with that same, the same opportunities. So I think it's what we make of it, but I think that we need to go out and recruit to support that next generation, the younger people, especially with the young families. I think that's obviously, it's just such a critical point in people's lives and their marriages as they're, just starting a family, which is such a critical point of where we need elected officials as well, in my opinion. And so, I just think that we need to go out and just really tell our stories. We've all been through it. When I first ran for office, I had 1 child, and my wife was pregnant with her second. We now have 5 children. The oldest is a freshman in college. So, you can raise kids and be an elected official, even at the local level, not making a lot of money, but you just have to be able to manage it. So we have to tell that story and recruit people and let them know that it can be done.
Do you think people in the community think you get paid more than you do? I'm just curious, right? Like they're like, oh, the mayor, right? You're like the mayor of New York City. Right, probably gets some big salary and has a bodyguard and a driver and all that. Like, I'm just curious, kind of from an anecdotal perspective, do you think there's an imbalance between what people think you make as doing the job of mayor and what it really is?
I can say for me, that was one of the biggest questions I got from people when I said I was going to run for mayor, who, kind of knew that I was had another job, and said, well, are you going to quit your job now? I said, no. I said, mayors may seem like a full-time job, and we're out in the public a lot and do a lot of events, but it is definitely not a full-time job. So yeah, I think there certainly is that thought about it. So what is it like? I'm guessing here, like 8,000 a year, 10,000 a year for Lakeville? Lakeville's is 10,000 for city council, and they just gave a raise to the mayor to 15. 15. Yeah. Wow. So you should quit your other job. You're fine. Yeah. Raise your 5 children. You might be able to afford diapers and formula. That would be it. Yeah, I think, that's about, I was doing calculation last night that 1 can of formula will last us 3 days. So I need about $600 a month in formula. So yeah, it's about an even trade on. Right, exactly. You're being mayor so you can pay for the formula. That's right. No, but I think that's a good point. And you mentioned like Lakeville has added 20,000 residents in these past couple decades. So I mean, your city has what, 70,000 or more residents? More, yep. And it's, $15,000 to be the mayor of a city of 70,000 people. Like, it is not really, doesn't correlate. But again, like you're saying, you can find a way to navigate this if you have a flexible job and a supportive home life and those kind of things. And I think that's what I encourage people to read the report too, because some of what they're doing is getting into recommendations about trying to find actual financial supports so that you can broaden the pool, especially for underserved communities, BIPOC communities, and the like. And I think that's, will be an ongoing conversation, is that, we're going to have a healthy democracy that, is representative of our communities. It's hard, right? We got to just recognize that it's hard, and that may well require some level of support or other ways to, really fully reflect the amount of time that it takes to serve in this position. So encourage people to take a look at that. I wanted to get back to something that Mayor Larson and I were talking about before, which is the idea of, don't read the comments, don't get over engaged in social media. And, it's kind of an offshoot of this political polarization. I imagine that it's not even so much partisanship sometimes, but just people believing they can say whatever they want, that, just kind of that idea of a certain level of respect or an attitude of kindness has been lost a little bit over time. One of the things that came out in the report are people saying that they received threats when they were campaigning, or that their family had received threats. And again, we see that especially with BIPOC individuals who are running for office. So I'm curious, for all of you, maybe just share a little bit about that kind of, have you seen a bit of a disintegration in that, in the discourse? And, how do you manage that? How do you navigate through? Because certainly I'm sure people have said hateful things to all of you in your roles in local office. Curious, kind of get your thoughts. Maybe Mayor Schierer, you could start us off. That'd be great.
Yeah, you bet. Great question. So there definitely has been a deterioration in just civility within the discourse of local politics. I think it's important. I was listening to you and Emily's conversation, and I think she's so right. You have to have discipline to stay away from, taking the bait, engaging in some, just some of the garbage that's out there. But at the same time, so that's so much of how people communicate in 2022. I've noticed there's times where I am not on social media for the most part, but there, I go to the grocery store, and there's a lot of times the narrative is formed by some of this online conversation that I'm not aware of, and so you got to keep your pulse on what's out there. But there's a really important lesson that I learned this year. So Fergus Falls was celebrating 150 years. And for the last 4 years, we've been working on revitalization of our downtown riverfront. And We opened phase one this summer as part of the 150th celebration of our community, and there was a lot of negativity on Facebook around this, over the last year and a half as we went through some really challenging times with, uncertainty around state bonding, around the economy, and just a lot of things. And when you asked me, if you would have asked me on June 15th, this project, it was great to get the first phase done, but we, by what people were talking on social media, the rest of this project is done. And then something amazing happened. People actually gathered at the river in this pavilion, in this space, talked to one another, and it immediately transformed the conversation, I think, amongst the council, amongst the elected officials, you get that negativity from Facebook that seems so overwhelming. When you actually have real people engaging face to face, it's amazing what can happen. And so we cannot lose sight of that. We have now, we went ahead, and phase two is we've already funded phase two. We're going forward with it. So I think you need to pay attention to it. But you just have to actually keep the sense of reality of what really that represents in your community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mayor Larson or Luke, any thoughts on that topic?
The only other thing I was going to add to it that is really helpful for me, and I find when I say this to people, it can be helpful for them. I am very used to the onslaught of things, many threats and lots of different things. There is very much a gendered piece to a lot of that is sometimes overt and sometimes not. Very violent language thrown at me, whether it's in emails or whatever. But at any rate, point is, what I have found that's really helpful is to think of it like I'm watching that email come in, but that is somebody else's script. I do not need to be a character in that person's drama. I am watching that interaction happen. I can see it, I understand it, but I don't have to play a part in it. And it is when the elected person plays an active role in that othering narrative, that things can really start slipping and people notice. And so it is really impactful and powerful for me. I'm not disregarding people. Absolutely get to have their opinions. I actually have no interest in limiting people's ability to say what they're going to say, or having any kind of limits on people's speech, even when I think it's dangerous or undignified. But it is how the person who's being accused narrates themselves through that. And there is a position of power and privilege in this, right? If I was citizen B, that's different. That's harassment. That's different. But when you have asked for somebody's vote, when you have asked for somebody to co-invest in a vision with you, they get to have an opinion on it, whether they voted for you or not. And sometimes I wish those opinions were a little quieter or a little kinder, but they get to have them. And so there is a way you can kind of navigate the space. And as Ben said, somebody does have to be paying attention to that. But the more that you are focused on, like Brian, you and I, you're not going to, even if we don't agree on something, you and I are going to be kind to one another. That's just, we're looking at each other. This is what humans do. It's, if you're in a different room with the door closed and things start getting weird when you don't know each other. So the more you really activate people face to face, like Ben said, or what Luke was saying, going door to door, they don't care if you're Republican or Democrat coming to the door most of the time. They want to hear what you think about investing in the services that are going to support their families. And so just keeping that interaction pure and person to person is, there's nothing like it. And it's not at all the same as the rhetoric that's out in the public space.
So you're saying I should stop replying to, those Twitter accounts that are all numbers that have an amount.
Oh, I know. Or keep it up. I don't know, Brian.
I don't know. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
For me, I've been lucky that mostly when it's someone in town, it's been mostly civil, and I just kind of take a play out of when I used to work for Congressman Eric Paulson. For those who know, he represented western part of Hennepin County, and when he got a tough email, he just picked up the phone and talked to the person, and they actually will really appreciate and respect you. And there's some lines where if it's depending on what they say, I may not respond, but I've taken that to heart and I do that quite a bit. And I'll keep doing that and be part of my kind of portfolio. I think two things that I found in our community, now that we're the 7th largest city in the Twin Cities, 9th in the state, there's a lot more focus on what happens in Lakeville from people outside of Lakeville than before. And so my first year on council, we had an issue where we were regulating how many foxes that a woman could have in her property. And that became an international issue. And so I was getting some pretty tough calls from around the world because my cell phone's on the city's website. I think open communication is really important. And then the other was during the pandemic, we had a business who did not necessarily comply with all of the regulatory decisions that came out of the Walz administration. And that was, again, became kind of a national story that we got kind of caught in the middle of. And then the other really that is the most disheartening are the school board elections in our community have been really, really volatile. And so the crosshairs have been more on supporters of candidates on kind of both sides of the aisle and on candidates. And so that has been a tough. I'm grateful that I haven't had to be in that personally, but I certainly try to offer leadership and some unity now that the election's over, and we'll see how next year goes. But the last two school board, this in 2022 and then our special election in 21 were pretty heated.
Interesting. Well, I know you've talked about in some media interviews that people kind of view the city through their schools.
For sure.
And so that's kind of one of the interesting dynamics I'm sure all of you deal with. And that, I mean, there's probably a certain percentage of people think the city runs the schools, right? Like there's that kind of the old fashioned version or, New York City version where they think you're responsible for the school district. But even if they know that that's not the case, just that their experience of community is largely through the schools, especially in a rapidly growing suburb like Lakeville. But I think that's true statewide too. That's kind of where your heart is in your community, is with the school and with the local sports team from the high school and all that. So that's another thing to think about. Well, we're approaching the end of the bottom of the half hour here, so I want us to wrap up, and maybe we'll even finish up a couple of minutes early, which no one has ever complained about in the Zoom era. So I want to ask you to give us your best pitch for inspiring somebody to run for local elected office. So either thinking back about how you were inspired, or somebody suggested you run, or other people that you have mentored, over the years. If we could close out with your best, 1 minute pitch each on why somebody should, run to, let's say you have an open seat on your city council and you're all going to be mayors and you want to have a good city council, of course, so you're recruiting somebody. What would you say to them? What goes into that? So Mayor Schierer, we'll start off with you.
Yeah, okay, great. So the pay sucks, the hours can be super long, and people are going to hate you. But there will never be anything more rewarding in your lifetime that you will do than serve as an elected official, with the exception of being a parent and a spouse. But the most incredible work that I've ever done and had the privilege of doing is serving in a local, is asking your neighbors for their vote and their confidence for you to lead their city. So. Yeah,
that's great. The first part threw me off a little bit, but you came around.
It's kind of a hook, though, isn't it? It's kind of a
yeah.
hook. Like it's your ear going.
Counterintuitive. Yeah, Mayor Larson, give us your pitch.
You know what? So local government to me is the most personal and important government. People care about what happens. You are actively in community with your neighbors. There is no shelter. You are not protected. You are on the job when you go to Target, or you're at the Y, or you're watching your sons play basketball. And there's nothing more awesome than the fact that that's the case. People care about your community. They care about where they live. They want to connect with you. And it is an honor and a privilege to be able to make decisions that impact your life as much as somebody else's. Like, you are in the work, and it is so fulfilling. It is so hard, and it is so completely worth it.
Excellent. Mayor-elect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you both said it very well. I think about a few specific times when I've asked people to run or to step into something, and that is really to understand where your heart is, and if you have a heart for service, there's no better way than local government. And whether it's running for office, or it's trying to get appointed to the planning commission, or appointed to the parks board or the arts board, or whatever you have, getting into that and kind of giving back to your community will be rewarding for your entire life. And I think, really, especially those who have kids, I think Emily said it best, having your kids participate in the process is so awesome. I mean, my kids get to see civics firsthand. And if you are a young parent and thinking about running, there's no better way to get the future generation to think about for themselves than you doing it and bringing them along for the ride.
That's excellent. That's a great place to close up the conversation. So Luke Hellier, Ben Schierer, Emily Larson, thank you all so much for being on the panel with us here today. Really appreciate it. Want to encourage people again to go to the Citizens League website. If you haven't clicked on the link that's in the chat to read the full report, you can certainly just go to citizensleague.org. You'll find it right there on the front page of the website. Again, along with the Citizens League, want to thank the Center for Rural Policy and Development for co-hosting this series. This has been our last one of 2022, but I strongly suspect there will be more opportunities to be a part of Interconnected in 2023. So stay tuned. We'll share that information with you as we go. Until then, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the sleet and slush and snow that is about to come to pretty much all of us. Take care, everybody.
Yeah, have a good Minnesota week. Thanks,
Yeah,
Brian. Thanks
everyone.
everybody.
Merry Christmas and
Thanks,
happy
everyone.
holidays. Thank you.
Bye-bye.